The second I saw the laminated private property sign floating down the creek like a sad little raft, I knew the HOA was messing with me again. I'm Yarden Dorsey. Bought a quiet slice of land on the edge of our North Carolina neighborhood, tucked behind a bend in the woods. The best part: it came with deeded creek rights, legally mine for fishing, swimming, or just sitting with a beer and watching the water roll by. Not community property, not shared, mine, and the HOA knew it. I made sure they did. But that didn't stop Rachelle Jennings, our HOA president with the personality of a malfunctioning blender and the haircut to match, from acting like she owned the whole planet. She was in her mid-50s, always marching around like she was running for office, clipboard in one hand, iced coffee in the other, wearing those oversized sunglasses like she was hiding from the paparazzi. Last month, she'd already tried to tell me that my shed windows were too reflective. 2 weeks ago, she left a note about my non-regulation mailbox, even though it was identical to 3 others on the same street. But this creek stunt, this was a new level of stupid. I marched down the bank, picked up the dripping sign, and stood there staring at the scene like I'd walked into a sitcom. 3 HOA board members, Rachelle, her little lapdogs Connie and Deb, were lounging in folding chairs, fishing lines cast into my creek, a cooler beside them full of what I assumed was probably hard seltzer and entitlement. There was even a Bluetooth speaker playing soft jazz. Like they were at some backyard resort, I cleared my throat. Loudly, Rachelle turned around slow like she'd been expecting me. "Oh, hey there, Yarden," she said with that fake cheer she always used when she was about to say something deeply condescending. "We figured since it's just a little creek, it wouldn't hurt to enjoy it as a community, you know. It's not like you're using it every day." "Let me stop you right there," I said. "That's private property, you're trespassing." Connie snorted. "Don't be dramatic." "It's just water." "Yeah." I held up a laminated copy of the deed I kept stored in a Ziploc under the porch. "This says otherwise. Creek rights are mine all the way from the bridge to the old oak." Rachelle rolled her eyes. "Well, we voted last month to open it up to HOA members." "Community access was approved." I stared at her. "You can't vote to give away something you don't own. That's not how property law works." She waved her hand. "Don't be difficult, Yarden. We're not harming anything. Besides, we've been coming here for weeks." That last part made my jaw clench. Weeks. I turned and headed back toward my house. Didn't say another word, just walked, because I had cameras. And now I knew I needed to check the footage. The moment my boots hit the porch steps, I was already dialing up the feed from the 4 cameras strung across my back lot. They weren't just for show. I'd wired them myself when I first moved in, buried the lines, and fed the storage to a private server. Not even the tech-savvy could scrub it. I hadn't checked the creek cam in weeks, not since early spring when a possum tried to drown itself in my tackle box. But now, with that little jab from Rachelle about coming here for weeks, I had a very specific reason. The footage loaded slow, but when it did, I sat down hard in the kitchen chair, one hand gripping the edge of the table tighter than I meant to. There they were. Not just fishing. Not just lounging, they'd brought a chainsaw. 3 weeks ago, right around 9 in the morning, Rachelle and 2 other HOA board members, not Connie or Deb this time, but 2 men I recognized as Alan and Gilbert, both of whom were on the Architectural Review Committee, had cut down a large dogwood tree near the creek. My tree. They dragged it a few feet, then used the trunk as a makeshift bench. 2 days later, they came back with bags of gravel and spread them over the mud path leading down. Another visit. They installed a rope swing off the low sycamore. The worst of it. One clip showed a group of kids, at least 6 of them, splashing in the water while the adults supervised from lawn chairs, beer cans in hand. I pushed away from the table, the chair screeching across the tile. This wasn't just trespassing. This was vandalism, endangerment, and illegal construction on private land. I printed the footage stills, time-stamped and clear, and locked the originals in a fireproof box. Then I made 2 calls. First, to a friend of mine, Monica Vega, former county prosecutor turned real estate attorney who owed me a favor from a land dispute I'd helped her sort out last year. Second, to the sheriff's office. By mid-afternoon, Deputy Harris was standing in my backyard, arms crossed, watching the footage on my tablet. "Yeah," he said after a long pause, "this is going in the report. They altered the land without permission. Cut down a tree, set up what looks like a recreation area and invited minors onto private property without the owner's consent. That's a cocktail of violations." "Can you cite them?" I asked. "Oh, we're past citations," he said. "You want to press charges?" I didn't even hesitate. "Yes," he nodded. "Good, I'll file this under criminal trespass and property damage. You'll get a case number by morning." I walked him back to his cruiser, then stood in the driveway feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. I'd expected a fight. What I hadn't expected was how deep their arrogance ran. They hadn't just crossed a line, they'd treated my land like it was theirs to renovate, Monica called later that night. "I reviewed the deed and easement language," she said. "It's airtight. Your property line extends 6 feet past the creek's northern bank. The tree they cut was well within your boundary. If they built anything down there, even a gravel path, that's considered a structural alteration. If you want to take this civil as well as criminal, I can file an injunction and a claim for damages." "Do it," I said. "Also," she added, "I pulled the HOA bylaws from the county clerk's office. They don't list your parcel under their jurisdiction. You're not technically a member." I blinked. "Wait, what? You're adjacent to the HOA zone, but not within its legal boundaries. They've been sending you fines and notices without any legal authority. That, my friend, is fraudulent behavior." I grinned for the first time all day. "So I'm not even in their little club, not even remotely." The next morning, I drove straight to the county courthouse and filed a formal complaint for trespass, vandalism, and attempted annexation of private property. Monica emailed me the drafted civil suit paperwork by noon. That afternoon, I walked back down to the creek. The rope swing was still there, swaying gently in the breeze like it didn't know it was evidence in an active case. Bits of gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped closer to the bank. I took pictures of everything: the gravel, the cut tree stump, the swing, the beer can someone had left behind. Then I printed all of it at the UPS store and dropped copies at the sheriff's station. By the time the citations were officially served 2 days later, the neighborhood grapevine had already kicked into overdrive. I was unloading groceries when my neighbor, Frank, a retired mechanic with a husky that barked at everything except thunder, wandered over. "Yarden," he said, "you really got them served?" "Sure did." He gave a low whistle. "Heard Rachel was yelling at the deputy like he was a waiter who forgot her salad dressing. She'll need a new hobby," Frank chuckled. About time someone stood up to them. That evening, a few more neighbors stopped by. A young couple from 3 houses down brought a lemon pie and asked if I'd be willing to share the footage with others who'd gotten fined or harassed. One woman, a nurse named Patris, said the HOA had threatened her with daily penalties over parking her car too close to the mailbox, despite having a driveway that curved exactly as city code allowed, so I started a folder. Not just for me, but for everyone. I called it HOA Overreach. Each folder had its own section: illegal citations, misrepresented boundaries, harassment, and now trespass. By the weekend, word had spread far enough that the HOA board called an emergency meeting at the community center. I didn't attend. I wasn't a member after all. But Monica did. As my legal representative, she had every right to be there, and she brought packets. Each board member got one. Inside, the footage, the civil complaint, the legal notice of their lack of jurisdiction over my parcel, and a warning that any further action taken against me would be considered harassment under state law. Monica told me later Rachel turned the color of fermented cranberry juice. The fallout was swift. By Monday, Gilbert had resigned. Connie tried to claim she'd never really supported the creek outings and blamed Deb, who was last seen arguing with a landscaper about whether her rose bushes violated the new xeriscape policy. The rope swing was quietly removed in the middle of the night, but it didn't matter. The damage was done, not to my land that could be restored, but to their credibility. The sheriff's office followed up with formal citations to all 5 members who'd appeared on the footage, including Rachel. Community trespass, unauthorized land alterations, and endangerment of minors. Total fines added up to over $15,000, and the best part, because they'd acted under the guise of HOA authority, the fines couldn't be paid with HOA funds, personal liability, out of pocket. I spent the next few days repairing the creek path, planting a new dogwood sapling, and adding 2 more cameras just in case. But honestly, I wasn't worried. Not anymore. Because now the entire neighborhood had seen what happens when you mess with the wrong property owner. And I had paperwork to prove it. 3 days after the emergency HOA meeting, a white SUV with tinted windows rolled up to the edge of my property and sat idling for nearly 10 minutes. I stood behind the screen door, arms crossed, watching as the driver, someone I didn't recognize, snapped photos of the creek, the new sapling, and my mailbox. He didn't approach, didn't say a word, just documented and drove off. I didn't need a name to know where he came from. Monica confirmed it the next day. She'd intercepted a request filed by the HOA's law firm for a property reassessment due to recent alterations made by the occupant. It was a weak attempt to trigger a zoning review, hoping to find a loophole to undermine my property lines or environmental impact compliance. Classic move when cornered. Shift the focus, create doubt, and stall. But it backfired in record time. The county planning department had already been looped in by Deputy Harris for the original trespassing report. When they saw the reassessment request and matched it to the sheriff's active case, it raised red flags fast. An inspector showed up the next morning, clipboard in hand, not to investigate me but to initiate an audit of the HOA's own zoning compliance. "I've got 6 open complaints in this district," he told me while walking the creek perimeter. "Yours just made the 7th. They've been pushing boundaries literally on multiple properties." He pointed out pink survey flags I hadn't noticed before. "This one here, that's your legal corner. You're clean. But the HOA's community garden, it's encroaching onto county land by about 20 feet. He took photos, made notes, and left with a copy of my deed. I didn't ask what would happen next. I already knew. By the following week, it wasn't just the sheriff's office knocking on doors. It was the county code enforcement team and 2 agents from the Department of Environmental Quality. Apparently, the gravel they spread by my creek had disrupted a protected runoff channel, and since it was done without permits, the HOA was now facing a state-level violation. I hadn't even filed that complaint. Someone else had. Turns out, after Monica shared my footage with a few other residents, one of them, a retired biology teacher named Mr. Givens, took it upon himself to forward it to the DEQ. He'd been quietly documenting runoff issues since the HOA rerouted part of a drainage ditch last summer, and now he had proof of unauthorized construction near a waterway. "This whole thing's been a long time coming," he told me while adjusting his fishing hat. "They tried to fine me last year for composting leaves, called it organic waste accumulation." He shook his head. "Meanwhile, they're dumping gravel into a protected channel like it's a sandbox. Within days, a cease and desist order was issued against the HOA for any further land alterations. The community garden was fenced off pending review. And best of all, the HOA's lawyer officially withdrew from representing them, citing conflicts of interest after discovering that Rachel had withheld details about their unauthorized use of my land. That's when everything started unraveling. The board called for a closed-door session to discuss restructuring. But the residents weren't having it. A group of volunteers organized an open forum in front of the community center, bypassing the formal HOA channels. They passed out flyers, brought folding chairs, and invited anyone with a complaint, concern, or story to share it publicly. I didn't plan to speak. But then Rachel showed up. She stood across the crowd, arms folded, flanked by Deb and Connie like she was still in charge of something. When a father of 3 described how the HOA had fined him for installing a toddler swing in his own backyard, citing unauthorized equipment, Rachel interrupted him. "Let's not confuse enforcement with harassment," she said loudly. "We've followed our bylaws to the letter." That's when I stepped forward. "You mean the same bylaws that don't apply to my property?" I asked. The crowd turned. "Or the ones you used to justify cutting down a tree on land that never belonged to you?" Rachel visibly stiffened. I held up a manila folder. "These are the updated enforcement reports," I said. "From the county, the sheriff's office, and the DEQ, you've got pending fines totaling over $25,000, and that's before the civil suit." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Rachel tried to cut me off, but I just raised my voice. "And just so everyone knows, I've submitted a formal complaint to the state HOA Oversight Board. I'm not the only one. According to the registrar's office, at least 9 of you were fined for violations that don't exist in the actual code." "That's financial misconduct." Deb muttered something, but Connie was already inching away. "Also," I added, "I've hired a surveyor to document any HOA encroachments on private property. If your fence line's been moved or if you've received a notice that doesn't match your deed, get it to me. We're compiling a class action lawsuit." The silence that followed was thick enough to chew. The next morning, I got a call from an investigator with the state attorney general's office. Apparently, the HOA's fines and citations, especially those issued to non-member properties, could constitute fraud under consumer protection laws. They were opening a formal inquiry. It didn't take long for subpoenas to start flying. The HOA's bank records were requested. So were their internal emails. And once those came out, the real rot surfaced. Turns out, Rachel and Gilbert had approved reimbursements to themselves for maintenance equipment that never showed up. Over $8,000 in receipts, half of which traced back to a landscaping company owned by Gilbert's nephew. With the AG involved, things escalated fast. Rachel was arrested 2 weeks later on charges of falsifying financial records and conspiracy to defraud. Gilbert was charged as a co-conspirator. The HOA's operating account was frozen. Deb and Connie tried to claim ignorance, but the email chains showed they'd both signed off on the creek beautification project even after Monica sent them the boundary documentation. Meanwhile, I finalized the civil suit with Monica. We didn't just go after damages for the tree and the trespassing, we included restitution for legal fees, land restoration, and emotional distress. The judge fast-tracked it under public interest since it involved a governing body acting outside its authority. We won. Full payout. Plus a court order mandating that the HOA post signage clarifying their jurisdiction boundaries. But the best part came during the final hearing. Monica handed the judge a final motion signed by over 40 residents requesting the dissolution of the HOA's current board under a provision in their own charter. With 2 members under criminal indictment and the 3rd resigning mid-investigation, it passed unanimously. A new board was elected within the month. This one made up of regular homeowners, a nurse, a retired firefighter, even Mr. Givens joined. They voted to freeze all fines and reassess every policy from scratch. One evening, about a month after the dust settled, I walked back down to the creek. The new dogwood was starting to take root. The rope swing was long gone. The gravel path had been cleared, the runoff channel repaired by a team of volunteers from the neighborhood. Frank passed by with his husky and gave me a nod. "You know," he said, "I think this place finally feels like a neighborhood again." I nodded, resting a hand on the wooden post I'd installed to mark my boundary line. Took a lot of noise to get to the quiet. And it was quiet now, water trickling, Leaves rustling, no folding chairs or jazz music, no trespassers or clipboards. Just the sound of a property owner standing exactly where he belonged. 3 months after the new board took over, the neighborhood had settled into something resembling honest peace. Lawn signs disappeared, mailbox warnings stopped appearing, and nobody had tried to sneak into my creek since the tree stump had been ground down and replaced with a small bench I built myself. Things felt earned, balanced. But that was before I checked my mail one unusually warm Thursday morning in October and found a certified letter from the county tax assessor's office. The letter said my property had been flagged for unreported structural additions related to recreational use, and that a reassessment was scheduled for the following week. Attached was a blurry photo of a wooden platform one I didn't recognize taken from above, like it had been shot by a drone. I stared at the photo for a good minute before realizing what I was actually looking at. It wasn't my property. It was a section of creek that curved south just below my boundary line. Except according to my deed, that land wasn't owned by the HOA either. It was county-maintained greenbelt, left natural for flood control. I drove straight to the planning office and requested the most recent permit logs for our neighborhood. The clerk handed me a file with fewer pages than I expected. One stood out. A permit request for a creekside wildlife observation deck, signed by none other than Deb Laramie. It had been approved under a forged parcel number, my parcel number. I called Monica from the parking lot. "They're building on county land and using your property number to secure permits," she said. "That's fraud, Yarden, real prosecutable fraud." I asked if we could get a copy of the drone footage. Monica told me she'd already filed the request. She sounded calm, but I could hear the edge in her voice. It wasn't just about property lines anymore. This was organized misrepresentation. By the end of the week, the assessor's office sent over the footage. It showed a crew of 4 workers hauling lumber and bolting together a wooden platform right along the creek. Each wore high-vis vests with no company name. They worked quickly, like they were on a deadline. The footage was time-stamped 5 weeks earlier while the board transition was still happening. I drove out to the site myself, followed the bend down past the public trailhead, and spotted the deck. It wasn't huge, maybe 10 feet by 12, but it had posts, a railing, and a mounted sign that read Community Observation Point, property of Cedar Hollow HOA. There was a second sign nailed to a tree behind it, a warning. Trespassing on HOA property is a violation. Cameras in use. I took photos. Then I called the county sheriff. Deputy Harris and a second officer showed up with a representative from the Department of Public Lands that afternoon. After 10 minutes of quiet discussion, the county rep turned to me. "They not only built on public land," she said, "they misfiled the permit under your lot. That's identity misappropriation. They're lucky they didn't run power lines out here or it'd be a federal matter." Deputy Harris nodded. "We'll need statements. And I'll be following up with the district attorney. This isn't just civil. This is criminal misrepresentation of government documents." The next morning, Deb was arrested. It happened before sunrise. 2 cruisers, no sirens. She was escorted out of her house in a robe, yelling about a misunderstanding. That afternoon, the new HOA board issued a public statement disavowing the platform project. They claimed Deb had acted alone, using leftover funds from the previous administration without board approval. But Monica found evidence that told another story. While digging through the HOA's financial disclosures, now legally required to be posted monthly, she found a strange series of reimbursements labeled environmental upgrades. The payouts had been approved by Connie, who'd quietly resigned 2 weeks into the new board's term, citing health issues. One of those disbursements matched the exact cost of materials used in the platform construction. We met with the assistant DA in her office downtown. Monica laid out the records, maps, and permit logs. She explained how Deb and Connie had used my parcel number to bypass the county's public land restrictions, redirecting funds from a discretionary account that was never audited under Rachel's administration. The Ada face didn't change much, but her tone did. This wasn't just fraud. It's conspiracy. They knew they couldn't build on county land, so they used your ID and hoped to bury it before anyone caught on. That's a felony. Within 48 hours, warrants were issued. Connie was picked up at her sister's place in Raleigh. During questioning, she admitted that Rachel had been the one to suggest the project before her arrest. They planned to frame it as an ecological improvement funded by member donations, then quietly absorb the space into the HOA's claimed boundary map. Only problem: they never expected the county to cross-reference parcel numbers. The fallout moved fast. The district attorney filed charges against Deb and Connie for conspiracy to commit fraud, misappropriation of funds, and falsification of government documents. The court froze their personal assets to secure restitution. The judge also approved a lien against the previous HOA's discretionary account to repay the county for unauthorized land use. What shocked the neighborhood most wasn't the arrests. It was learning how much of this had been happening in the background under the radar, buried in spreadsheet rows and vague meeting minutes. All that beautification money. Turns out a good chunk of it had funded similar projects: landscaping, furniture, even a failed attempt at a nature trail through an easement that never belonged to the HOA. The county revoked their nonprofit status. The remaining board members voted to dissolve the HOA charter entirely. Not suspend, not restructure, dissolve. It passed unanimously. They filed the paperwork with the state, effectively disbanding the organization and transferring any remaining funds after restitution to a neighborhood improvement trust managed by a third-party stewardship group. No one would be fined again. No more bylaws, no more compliance inspections. Just neighbors responsible for their own homes. The observation platform was dismantled by a county crew within 72 hours. The sign was pulled down and boxed as evidence. The railing was removed, the posts dug up, and the ground restored to native growth with the help of local volunteers. I helped plant willows along the bend fast growers, good for erosion control. Later that week, I was invited to speak at a community potluck. The new stewardship group had rented out the park pavilion and set up long tables with covered dishes and folding chairs. No speeches were required, but when someone handed me the mic, I stood. I didn't want to be the guy who sued his neighborhood, I said. But I also didn't want to be the guy who let it slide when people thought power gave them permission. There was a long pause. But I think we learned something here, not just about boundaries, but about how quickly silence becomes allowance. None of this would have happened if more of us had spoken up sooner, but we're speaking now. The applause wasn't loud, but it was steady, honest. Afterward, a woman I hadn't met before, a retired ER nurse named Wilma, handed me a slice of peach cobbler and a note with her property coordinates scribbled on the back. "Turns out I've got a spring that feeds into your creek," she said. "If you ever want to test the water, I've got the kits." I nodded and tucked the note into my pocket. "Might take you up on that." As the sun dipped behind the trees, I walked the long way home along the creek path. The air smelled clean. The water moved slow and steady, untouched by gravel or rope swings or folding chairs. Just the sound of leaves brushing against each other and the faint ripple of current finding its way forward. At the bend, I paused. Where the platform had been, there was now only soft earth and a patch of young grass, barely visible but growing. Nature, reclaiming what had been borrowed without asking. I stood there until twilight, not watching for intruders this time, not guarding anything, just standing. Letting the quiet return, knowing it was earned.